Well, hello there. Welcome to a very special little mini episode of The Strange and Deadly Show. I would imagine you didn't expect you'd hear from us again on this feed for quite some time. We didn't think we'd be coming back to you so soon, but unfortunately we had some very sad news recently that affected both Tom and I quite deeply. Before we get into that, well, my name is Christopher Clayton.
And I'm Tom Elliott.
And we're brought here with you, I suppose, really to kind of share our sadness with you, to grieve alongside you. George Romero passed away, and the news hit me. I'd actually was watching John Wick 2 and had finished watching it and was kind of elated that I'd seen a film that I really enjoyed, and I was popping onto Twitter to talk about that film and sort of express my opinion about it, and I happened to see the news that popped up there immediately. And it's one of those things, really, I don't know if you get this sometimes, Tom, where you'll log on to the news, you know, you'll pop on BBC News or something, and there's a feeling of dread that I hope nobody I like has died, I hope nothing horrible has happened in the world, and you go on there and there's that little bit of feeling of anticipation and dread that something horrible might have happened. And I always seem to have that these days because there's so much bad news that comes our way, whether it's celebrities dying, you know, people we really care about dying, some horrible atrocity in the world that's taken place. And in this case, I logged onto Twitter and I immediately saw there that, you know, the headline was that George Romero had passed away, and at that time it wasn't 100% confirmed. It was still a rumour, but it seemed like it was true, and indeed it was. How did you find out the news, Tom?
Much the same way, I think. That seems to be the way of it now, more than even the news, unless you open up the internet and a news story hits you in the face. More often than not, it is Twitter now, and of course you sent me a message a few moments later after I'd seen it. So, yeah, incredibly sad. I think you and I, our love of horror very much comes from the 70s and the 80s onwards. You know, we might like other periods, but that seems to be where our main love lies, and that's where we kind of grew up with the movies of people like George Romero. Although they were older than us making their movies, we were kind of younger appreciating them. And unfortunately, as time's gone on, those people are getting older and older. We lost Wes Craven last year, was it?
I think so, or the year before maybe, yeah. Might be last year.
And now George Romero, and unfortunately that seems to be the time that we are.
Yeah, and I said actually on Twitter that very night that I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to dread my heroes fading away. You know, and it's an inevitability. You know, my favourite director of all time is John Carpenter, and he's getting up there in age. And of course, touch wood, I certainly don't want anything to happen to him anytime soon. But I'm cognizant of the fact that a lot of the people I grew up worshipping, heroes of mine, are not going to be here for as long as I'd like them to be. And Romero, you know, there are probably not that many directors really that would kind of force us by way of our love of them to get back on mic and record a little mini episode like this. But we felt like we had to, because George Romero was a tremendous hero to me. He was somebody who meant a lot to me. I always felt very passionate and sort of emotionally involved in a lot of the movies that he makes and had made. And I felt just a tremendous sadness really to know that he was gone, especially given that you know, there are some people who you hear about and they've been in poor health for a while, as we will go through, a summary of his career, and we'll look at some of the films that he made and everything, and sort of end up at where we were a couple of days ago hearing about his death. As it turns out, he had a very, very brief illness that took him very, very quickly. And I suppose in a way there's a comfort in knowing that he didn't have to suffer for a very long time. But I didn't know he was ill. You know, it wasn't unusual for Romero to not make a film for many, many years. He had a lot of trouble with funding his movies, funding the productions he really wanted to make. And so it wasn't unusual to me that he hadn't made a movie since, 2009 maybe. So it came out of the blue to me to hear that news. And of course, you know, I will speak about an experience of mine that wasn't experienced by me firsthand, but was experienced via somebody else, and it was given to me as a gift, an experience that was captured on video that really meant a lot to me. And even seeing him there, where he's an older guy, he's got those huge glasses on, which I always used to make fun of in a playful way, you know, those huge glasses. And but what a character, Tom! What a character.
I think you're absolutely right that, and not to put anyone's life above anyone else's, but there's probably not many people who we would have turned the mic on again at this moment for, but he changed everything, and
Yeah.
no one had a bad word to say about George Romero. He was this consummate gentleman, very gentle. And there's a saying by Clive Barker that I read once, and I think he actually posted it on Twitter when he used to tweet a lot, and it was horror heals and sentiment sickens. And you tend to find that with a lot of those guys who were making the movies at that time, when there was this incredible energy around the horror genre. They were discovering what practical effects could do. Technology was getting better. People like George Romero could start to experiment with things, and there was this tremendous energy about it. So it was a great time for horror, but maybe alongside that, he was just such a sweet, sweet man.
And there are lots of great directors. This is the thing. There are so many great directors in so many different genres, but there are very few true innovators. And Romero created an entire subgenre, an entire genre of his own. And it's a funny thing to think, well, if you look at Black Sabbath, for example, arguably the inventors of heavy metal. They're somebody who created a band that created a particular sound that then reverberates through the years and becomes, people take it and they refine it and they change it and they alter it but it influences them. It's created something. Romero is very much the same way in the horror genre, in the film genre, full stop. If you look at The Walking Dead, for example, how popular that is, how it's managed to capture a certain angle, a certain part of a market that is largely full of casuals. There are a lot of people who watch The Walking Dead who are not particularly into horror movies, who don't really find much to enjoy there in the way that we do, but they're into it because of the drama, they're into it because of the characters. In a way, in that show, the zombies almost feel like, the dangerous kind of bit on the side, really, where the main thrust of it is the character interplay and the humans being deadlier than the zombies sometimes. But without this one man, that wouldn't exist. And that's a powerful thing. That's a really, really powerful thing. And it's something that, I can't really say of John Carpenter. Yet, certainly you can make the argument about Halloween being the first proper slasher movie, the one that kind of defined it and brought it into the mainstream. But I don't know if that's the same thing, really, because John Carpenter was somebody who did that and then went on to do a lot of other different things. If you look at his filmography through the 80s especially, virtually every movie he made was completely different to the last one. George Romero, on the other hand, made lots of different stuff, certainly, but he was primarily known for being this guy who created this being, the zombie. And we're going to get into that. We'll do an overview of his career in just a moment here with some stuff that I've written down that we can kind of go through. But he created this entire thing, all of his own invention that was taken from something else, but made his own.
The kind of rules he set down, not that he sat down with a pad and made up rules, maybe he did, but there was obviously a bit of kind of experimentation between what we see of the zombies in Night of the Living Dead to Dawn of the Dead. But by Dawn, they've pretty much arrived. In Night, there's a couple of things where you think that maybe just doesn't quite fit with how they turned out, but he was still finding out what they were. He set that down so definitively that even now, if you stray too far from that, it just doesn't feel right. And people do different kinds of zombie movies and maybe try different things like fast zombies or this kind of zombie, that kind of zombie. And I'm okay with fast zombies, to be honest, in their place. I'm not that precious about it, but sometimes someone will do something and you just kind of go, that just doesn't feel right. And what you're going back to is what Romero set down, and that's why it's so definitive. But I think even more than that, and there's something that I'm probably as guilty of as anyone, is saying it's all about the zombies. There is other stuff in his filmography that is great, and there's stuff there that I probably should have hunted down and watched that I haven't. Arrow Video have got a box set coming up soon of those very kind of films, and maybe now's the time to address that as well, and I should make that effort.
I completely agree with you. And I mean, here's the thing. I'm sure some of you are listening. You're going to think, well, you're focusing on the zombie stuff here. Well, we're doing that because that was Romero made a lot of movies, and he made a lot of great movies, but he was particularly known for being somebody who was an innovator of this particular style of film, this particular genre, and this particular creature. And so that's why it's important to mention it. But certainly as we go through this, we'll kind of pick up on some bits and pieces that he did outside of that genre that are really important too. I've got some stuff that I've written down here that we'll kind of go through. And then after that, Tom, I'd like to perhaps talk with you just a little bit about your first memories of some of the first stuff you saw from Romero when you remember seeing his films for the first time, and perhaps I'll offer my own views on that and some of my own memories of it. But I'll begin here by saying, so Romero was born on February 4th, 1940 in the Bronx in New York. He was certainly a New Yorker. That much is noticeable from the accent immediately. He attended Carnegie Mellon University, graduating in 1960 and immediately moving into directing. His first directorial credit on IMDb is the short film Expostulations, which I haven't seen. I don't suppose anybody in the modern day would have seen it, but it was made in 1962, but it was his first feature film, a creepy horror piece entitled Night of the Living Dead, released in 1968, that truly began his career. Now, how could Romero even know when he made the film, the first in a series of 5, as it turns out, that he was creating a genre and setting a benchmark that countless filmmakers would seek to better in the years to come? Romero's retooling of the zombie as a bloodthirsty ghoul that moves slowly and feasts on flesh had never been done before. It was a move away from the Haitian folklore that first birthed the zombie as a creature that serves as a reanimated vessel for spirits to inhabit. Here, Romero reinvented the creature as a person having risen from the dead, rising up from his or her graves to haunt the earth. So, of course, Tom, we covered Night of the Living Dead as part of the Strange and Deadly show. It was Night and Dawn, indeed, were part of the Section 3 list. They wouldn't have been films that we ordinarily would have covered, would we? Because we've sort of taken this stance. And it's again, we said it at the time, it's no offence to anybody who covers franchise horror. You know, the Ancient Slumber guys, for example, that is certainly their forte and what they do. For us personally, we didn't feel like we could really add that much to it, to talking about the same franchises. But there were 2 films that we had no choice, really. We had to cover them. We did the best job that we could. And I think we felt at the time that the film, we'd seen it so many times that perhaps the power of it had lessened a bit on us, on a reviewing of it.
That's right. And I don't even think that's a criticism of the film, because there was a period in our lives when we were more fond of it than we are now. And, you know, it's not that we don't recognise its importance. We absolutely do.
Yeah, definitely. So though they might move slowly, Romero's zombies were simply too great in number, frequently overwhelming their victims. He refined the idea even further when he began work on a sequel entitled, of course, Dawn of the Dead, which was released in 1978. Now, before Dawn arrived, Romero released 2 cult classics in 1973's The Crazies and 1978's Martin, the latter a take on the vampire story with a grounded experimental feel that suited its art movie appeal. Now, we did cover Martin on the show as well. What are your thoughts on those particular movies, Tom? Have you seen The Crazies, first of all?
I have. I saw it quite a few years ago when Blue Underground brought it out. I wasn't overly enamoured with it, to be honest. I found the cinematography was quite small. You know, it focused in on, and maybe this is memory, I'd have to go back and watch it, but it focused in on things very closely, so there was no sort of breadth to it, no sort of vision of the bigger picture, and maybe that's out of necessity, I don't know. But I'd really like to watch it again and see whether I'd reevaluate it and have a different opinion. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, it feels a little bit like a prototype of what would come later, but released in the same decade as Dawn of the Dead, I don't know that it has its own ideas, of course. I don't know if it ever really stood a chance of quite measuring up to it. But Martin is the one that I find interesting, because when we revisited it, and we both rewatched it for the show, I think I came away from it finally having gotten to grips with it perhaps better than I had done in the past. I'd always been a bit kind of on the movie, like I like some of it, but I'm not quite sure it all quite hangs together. And the last time I saw it, for some reason, it seemed to sort of gel better for me. And I think I remember from your side of things, you've always been a bit iffy with it, haven't you?
It's just that I need to really be in the mindset for it, because it's a very slow film. So I probably need to be in a place where I've got a lot of time, no distractions, where I can just sit and watch it. And if I find myself in that moment, which I have done in the past, then it really does work for me. I've got a lot of respect for Martin, and I do enjoy it. But it's not something I can just throw on any time and watch. It really needs to be the right time.
Yeah, it's pretty slow and it's pretty brooding, but it's also quite unique, I think. It's as a vampire story, it's a pretty unique thing. But while those two films were loved by some people, it was Dawn of the Dead that further cemented Romero as a horror director with smarts. Free of the black and white of Night of the Living Dead, Romero was able to show a zombie-ravaged world in full colour with lashings of bright red blood. Not the best blood you've seen on screen. It was pretty red paint like, but the film also continued the concept of a group of survivors fighting for their lives in one location, only this time it was a huge mall as opposed to a crumbling house. Romero used library music in many parts of the film to convey a sense of humour, but his usage of Italian prog rock band Goblin to fill out parts of the soundtrack with dramatic music really kind of upped the energy and action of the picture. And of course we revisited that on the show as well, alongside as part of the double bill there with Night of the Living Dead. There's probably not much more we can add to that really, but we both consider it a stone cold classic.
Absolutely.
Romero would continue to refine his ideas further a few years later, but before that came two beloved cult movies that bridged the gap. Night Riders came first in 1981, taking elements of Arthurian legend, adventure and perhaps a touch of Mad Max to serve a completely different kind of story for the director. Veteran actor Ed Harris took first billing in the film, with makeup effects artist Tom Savini having a notable role too. Now, Night Riders is one film that I've had in my collection for quite a while. It's sitting up there. And I'm ashamed to say I've never taken the time to watch it. Now, to be completely fair, to be honest with you, I'm not just being sort of, I'm not trying to exclude Romero from my viewing habits. I'm a big Planet of the Apes fan. I still haven't seen Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, and I've had it for ages as well. Sometimes, for some reason, you've just got a block there that you need to get past.
Yeah.
But Night Riders, is that one you've seen, Tom?
Many years ago, and I'm probably on some crappy thing. It just doesn't stick in my head, and I guess that's what I was talking about before. I guess we do focus too much on the zombies sometimes, when I really should be trying to unearth those not forgotten treasures, but maybe less appreciated treasures, and that's something I'm going to try and remedy.
Yeah, I'm going to do it as well. I'm hoping to perhaps even get to it this coming weekend after we've released this show, but it's a film that I was doing some reading today, and it seems to be pretty well loved by Romero fans as being a very different kind of film for him, but kind of a cult classic in its own way. Now, of course, 1982's Creepshow took 5 stories and put them together in one film with a wraparound story. Ed Harris returned for Father's Day, a popular segment in the film. That film took influences from the EC comics of the 50s, and it felt similar to Tales from the Crypt, which of course would become a huge television property as the 80s rolled on. I think we've said before, Tom, but we're both huge fans of that film, Creepshow.
Oh God, yeah. It's one of the films that I think if you want to get a kid into horror, and I'm not suggesting anyone should go out there and start showing kids horror films, but it so beautifully bridges that gap between comic books and horror films that I think it's a real good one for kids. Let's put it out there. Both you and I were watching this stuff when we were far too young to be watching it.
Yeah, definitely.
And if you're going to give a kid a horror movie, I'd give him Creepshow. And I'm not saying you should, so don't blame me. But I think it's a really good introduction to horror movies for kids. And I still love it. I think it's a great film.
Listen, I'm not going to lie to you. This is a tribute show, so I want to be as clean as possible. But I was watching Linnea Quigley's workout video, mate. I was young, but I was feisty, so I understand. Well, 1985 would see the release of Day of the Dead, the third in Romero's Dead trilogy. Now, by this point, zombie movies were becoming more and more popular, of course, almost all of them reusing Romero's ideas. Yet it was the master himself who ultimately pushed the genre forward once more, this time employing the services of makeup effects startup K&B. Now, Day was a considerably bleaker film, the darkest of the original 3. While it perhaps lacked the energy and humour of Dawn, it made up for it with some striking and truly groundbreaking effects, and a madcap performance from Joe Pilato as Captain Rose. Still one of my favourite performances, just absolutely bonkers. Romero also introduced the character of Bub, an intelligent zombie mentored by Dr. Logan, who shows real signs of learning basic tasks and understanding human speech and instructions. The film ends in an outstanding series of sequences where the villainous army men are torn to shreds by rampaging zombies, with Savini mentoring K&B as they employed new methods and tools to help create some of the best practical effects seen up to that point. I think when we did the little Romero special that we had to do, the double bill Night and Dawn, I think we both came away from that, because we talked obviously a little bit about some of the other Dead films he made subsequently, and I think we both came away from that saying that Day might be our favourite.
I would definitely agree with that. And
yeah,
I probably said that at the time. I think Night and Dawn are easier films to like. I remember watching Day for the first time and not particularly gelling with it. It's a film you need to work a bit harder to like. But when you get there, when you're looking for a bit more because you've so exhausted Night and Dawn, I think that's when Day really starts to come into its own. I absolutely love Day.
Yeah, it's a very different film tonally. I mean, you would think that the destruction of the world would be pretty bleak no matter what film it's in. But Dawn of the Dead actually has quite a lot of humour in it, and there's some zaniness and goofiness to it. Whereas Day is pretty straight. I mean, I suppose you could make the argument that Joe Pilato is comical and how over the top he is as Rhodes, but it's a pretty dark movie, and it ends in a vaguely hopeful way, I suppose. But in particular, I think what really stands out for me, I mean, I personally, I love the tone of it. I really enjoy that. I like how dark it is, but the makeup effects in it, they're still fantastic.
Definitely.
Even today, some of the best practical effects, I think, in any horror movie.
I think it's Tom Savini's masterpiece, really, in terms of it, what he was achieving at that point. And you can see, you know, Friday the 13th. Well, let's go back to Dawn of the Dead, then Friday the 13th, and he's building up his craft, and then we get to Day of the Dead, and it's just like, bang, there it is. And it's very dark, you know, there's not much light in there at all, in Romero's script and everything. I read some of the original scripts a while back. I can't remember them that well, but maybe it's one of those things that sometimes necessity actually gives you a better product than if he'd have got everything he wanted, because they really got together and made something special.
In a way, you can look at Romero's career and you can look at Savini's career, and there are real parallels there, in that I think you can see refinement from product to product. You know, like you say, if you look at Dawn of the Dead and then you look at Friday the 13th, there's an immediate noticeable improvement in terms of Savini's effects, and I think likewise between Night and Dawn and between Dawn and Day, there's a real improvement there. So Romero finished the 80s with Monkey Shines, which is a less successful horror movie about, believe it or not, an evil monkey. Did you ever see Monkey Shines?
I have not, I'm afraid.
It's a bit daft, really, but
right.
Yeah, not one of his finest films. But he entered the 90s and released two further films. 1990's Two Evil Eyes was the first of them, his co-headliner with Italian horror maestro Dario Argento. Entering the 90s, which is when Argento's decline began, he pretty much made opera and then was like, I can't be bothered anymore. That's always been my take on Romero. Romero handled one segment and Argento handled the other, both segments being based on short stories written by Edgar Allan Poe. What are your thoughts on Two Evil Eyes? I've never seen it.
I enjoy it quite a bit, and I think the general consensus from what I've read is that Argento's story is the better one. I actually disagree. I think it's a pretty solid effort from George Romero. It's been a while since I've seen it, so I can't sort of zing off why that really is. But at the time, I was reviewing DVDs, and it was the time when Arrow was really starting to pick up speed, and they released Two Evil Eyes. So I did delve into it at that time, and I just remember that the impression I got from it was that George Romero's was the better story. People might disagree with that, and that's fine, but I think it was quite an enjoyable movie. You know, I don't think it's gonna knock anyone's socks off, but it was pretty solid and enjoyable.
Yeah, I believe Argento did The Black Cat, didn't he?
He did, yeah, which is, there's so many versions of The Black Cat. Fulci did one, which I think is a bit of an underrated Fulci movie. I actually really like that. But yeah, it's not as good as Fulci's version, but it has some really grisly Savini effects in that one as well.
Oh, nice. Okay, so I do need to check that out then. Basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's one that for some reason has just passed me by, but because I'd always read that it wasn't very good, and I know that Romero going into the early 90s wasn't at his best. Argento certainly wasn't. He was sort of heading towards mediocre territory even then. So it's interesting to hear that people seem to really like the Argento side of it. Romero's final film of the 90s was 1993's The Dark Half, which was based on Stephen King's novel. Again, not one I've seen. What about yourself?
I'm afraid not, no. That'll have to go on the list as well.
Yeah, it will do. I mean, certainly some of the films that you're getting to now, before we get back to the rest of the Dead movies that he ended up making from the 2000s onwards, I'm a little bit sort of sketchy on. After the release of that film, which doesn't seem to be have been received particularly well. After the release of that film, Romero's output slowed considerably. And I remember reading this actually at the time. He began finding it difficult to fund the films he wanted to make, with studios requesting that he direct another film in his Dead series, something he had no interest in doing at the time. That's been a real problem for Romero, and it was for many, many years. And I remember reading interviews with him where he would say that he wanted to get projects made, and they didn't want to give him any money unless he said, yes, I'll make another Dead movie. I think that's a terrific shame. Imagine having your creativity stifled by somebody at a studio who just wants you to make the thing that is popular, instead of being able to make, can you imagine somebody at Warner Brothers now telling Christopher Nolan, well, sorry, you can't make Dunkirk, mate. You've got to go back and make The Dark Knight 4. Yeah. Imagine that, and somebody putting up with that. But he seems like he had no choice.
It's quite sad, isn't it? And
yeah,
it's one of the few kind of professions, I suppose, being a filmmaker, where people, or maybe an actor as well, or a musician, where people just won't let you forget what you've done if it was a great success at the time. I mean, who says to me, that job you done 20 years ago, I was working in a kitchen in New York. No one says to me, you got to keep cooking that meal for the rest of your life because we used to really enjoy it. And it's quite sad, because obviously he did want to do different things. He did want to explore different things. And in his own mind, he probably felt the Dead series was dead. And they kept on. And then when he did start making them again, fans were like, oh, really? It's really quite tragic.
Like the way you put that, actually, it makes it sadder, doesn't it? Really, to think of it that way. That when he finally started doing what he thought people wanted, people sort of turned against it and didn't want it. It's interesting actually to look at this period of time, really, for some of the great masters of horror as we know them today. Romero's career wasn't in a particularly good place. Argento was making films like Trauma. He was starting to be on a real downslide that, in my personal opinion, he's never recovered from since. John Carpenter at this point was again moving into material that wasn't so hot. Wes Craven was doing Wes Craven's New Nightmare. His career didn't really pick. That film wasn't a success. It's funny because it's one of my favourite in the series, but that film wasn't really a tremendous success, and he didn't really have a big success again until Scream. So a lot of the masters of horror, they weren't having a great time in the 90s. John Carpenter was doing Ghosts of Mars and then was out of the game for years and years and years. I wonder what was happening there.
It's interesting, isn't it? I guess the business was changing. And I've said before that I felt Romero was at his best in a certain time and place. And so I guess maybe the business was changing, and I guess they were facing this opposition to them doing different stuff. So they were doing stuff they weren't 100% passionate about. I don't know, but I have to again think back to my own life. In my 20s, when I had a bit more energy and was really trying to make a name for myself in what I was doing, and I would go above and beyond, and you have that drive. You're very much like that of that age, and there's probably very few creatives who can keep that going, that level, throughout their whole life. Because now I just want to go to work and come home. You know what I mean? I can't be bothered putting that level of all-encompassing effort into something. So maybe we should give these guys a break sometimes, because they do get judged so harshly.
You know, it's funny, Tom. You were saying that you were working as a cook in New York, and working in a kitchen in New York, certainly. And at what age were you doing that?
I think I went there when I was about 19 to when I was
Okay.
21. So
Because I think when I was about, and it makes me incredibly sad because you were saying, you've got so much energy back then. When I was a teenager at that point, I was sitting in my bedroom in my underpants playing GTA Vice City on my PlayStation 2, and I promise you this is true, falling asleep reading books. And it happened all the time. I'd be laying on my bed reading one of Terry Pratchett's Discworld books, and I would almost always fall asleep with a book on my chest. Oh. So what an exciting life I lived, Tom, compared to your good self. But yeah, no, you make a very good point. And it's funny, you look at John Carpenter's output, for example, through the 80s, and you go, bloody hell, it's film after film after film after film. It's Halloween from the late 70s, and then you go into Escape from New York, The Thing, Prince of Darkness, They Live, Big Trouble in Little China, and then you get to the 90s, and that streak is just gone, and you think to yourself, well, what happened? Perhaps it was just the fact that horror wasn't in vogue during the 90s. Scream was really, whether you like the film or not, Scream was the film that revived horror as a mainstream genre again. So perhaps there was an element of that. Now, Romero didn't return. His first film that he made after 1993's The Dark Half was Bruiser in 2000, which I did see, which is one of his least liked films. Have you ever seen that one, Tom?
I'm afraid not, no.
Yeah, it was not, if you can imagine that length of time waiting for a new Romero film, and then you get that, and it wasn't good at all. And it really seemed like he was, as much as I love Romero, it was somebody who perhaps had his time and it was over. Now, fortunately, Romero did return to prominence as a director with the release of Land of the Dead in 2005, which returned him to the franchise that made him popular. The film offered a more modern apocalyptic setting for the zombie mythology he had created, with one zombie in the film in particular. I can't remember if there was a name for the zombie or not, furthering the idea. Big Daddy. Okay. With that zombie furthering the idea Romero had created with Bub, of a creature who has learned and is beginning to recognise his place in the world. Land of the Dead is an interesting one. When it came out, I actually really liked it a lot, and I thought it was a good fight. Not as good as the original trilogy by any means, but I remember quite liking it, and then have revisited it in subsequent years and have noticed the CGI effects and things like that a bit more, and have gone a bit colder towards it since then.
It's been a while since I've seen it. I can't remember it that well. I think I generally quite like it. I think the sad thing is, though, that the Dawn remake had come out by this point, hadn't it?
Yeah.
And then it was announced that Romero was doing Land, and the Dawn remake might have been one of the contributing factors for Land happening. Probably was. But again, there was so much expectation on it, and did he quite deliver? That's the thing, and he was probably always onto a loser. But I think it's decent. My main problem with that film is the lead character, the guy, the one who's in The Mentalist. I can't remember the actor's name. He was just such a charisma vacuum in that movie, and considering he's got so much personality in The Mentalist, it's like, what was going on there? Because he's just this boring character in the middle of a film, which has actually got quite a bit going for it.
Yeah, his co-lead in the movie, from what I remember, is Asia Argento, which is really the only mainstream, I don't want to say Hollywood, because it wasn't a Hollywood movie, but you know what I mean. It was one of the few movies I've seen her in that had like a proper sort of release strategy and was seen by a lot of people. And I've never rated Aja as an actress particularly, so it that didn't help either. But it had some good ideas. It had some good. It had crazy ass Dennis Hopper in it as well, which is always a treat. So Romero followed Land with 2 additional sequels, both of which had less successful receptions critically. There was 2007's Diary of the Dead and 2009's Survival of the Dead, which brought the franchise up to 5 entries, though they were not well received. Survival remains the last feature film that Romero directed, which is a damn shame, firstly, that we've lost him, and secondly, that is sort of, that's the last one there, because I would have loved for him to have made one more, whether it was a dead film or whether it was anything else. To be honest, I would have preferred if he just made something that he really wanted to make, and have made something good. Because Survival of the Dead certainly is my least favourite of all the films in the series by far.
I can't quite remember between Diary and Survival, to be honest. Like I said on our Dead show, I think I saw each of them once and just never went back. I do think Survival was the one that turned me off the most. I think I probably turned that off with a bit of a sense of, and I hate to say it in a sort of celebration of the man's life, but a bit of a sense of disgust at how bad it was. I feel terrible saying that now, but again, sometimes things, when you rewatch them, you start to accept the flaws and appreciate the positives. So for Romero's sake, I will give them another watch. I'll check whether there's any decent releases out there and maybe get them again. Because if nothing else, if there's a commentary track or something on there where George is talking about them, then that might be something quite interesting, because I always love to hear him talk about what he was doing. So, it is sad that we ended up with Survival.
Yeah, I think what I was most disappointed with, apart from the sort of story issues and things like that, was that George was quite happy to begin using a lot of CG effects in his movies. And for somebody who was so well known for employing the use of makeup effects artists who were doing such great practical effects, to then move on to, in Diary of the Dead in particular, there are so many horrible CG effects in it that I think take away from the film. And it's a damn shame, really. I'd love to have seen Romero perhaps return to using practical stuff. The thing is, I'm sure some of it was budgetary. He didn't have a lot of money to play with.
You're absolutely right. The CG element did look bad, I think. But you're also right about that budget being a factor in that. I remember reading a comment made by Greg Nicotero of K&B, and he heard that George was making a movie and he didn't have much money to do it. And I think he was speaking to someone's third hand, like someone came to him and said, George is making a movie. And Greg was like, well, why hasn't he called me? And this person was obviously like, he hasn't got much money to be doing this, I don't think he can pay K&B prices. And Greg Nicotero was like, tell him to give me a call. That's the deepness of his affection for Romero. And I can't remember whether it was Diary or Survival or both, but I think it's a very sad but sweet story as well.
That's a shame, isn't it? Because that's a dream team up, isn't it? Getting Greg Nicotero involved again. Him, if I mean, the sad thing, I suppose, is that if that was going to happen nowadays, Greg Nicotero's value has gone up tremendously, because not only does he do effects on The Walking Dead, but he's a producer on, and he actually has directed quite a few episodes. So he's sort of become a prominent director on that show as well. So I'd imagine his value would have skyrocketed. But that is a shame. But let's not have regrets about it, because Romero did bring us so much great stuff. He was the inventor of the zombie genre. He did make all of these crazy, kooky, wild films. Some films that were really different to what you would know him for. We haven't seen it. Night Riders, I know it to be very different. You look at Creepshow, for example. Creepshow's so different to anything he did before, but it stands out as, I love rewatching that movie. It never gets old for me, even though I've seen those stories so many times, and some are better than others. But what a tremendous job he did. Unfortunately, we come to sort of the saddest part here of what I've written down, which was the reason that George is no longer with us. According to a statement released to the Times by Romero's producing partner Peter Grunwald, Romero had a brief but aggressive battle with lung cancer and passed away. When I read this, it got me a bit teary, so hopefully I can make it through just reading it. Passed away listening to his favourite soundtrack from the film The Quiet Man, with his wife Suzanne and daughter Tina by his side. He was 77 years old. So a sad ending for him, but there's comfort in the fact that it seemed to be a brief, as it says there, a brief battle, and that it seemed like he didn't suffer for very long.
Yeah. And, like you said, there's family there, listen to his favourite soundtrack. You know, good journey, George. Good journey.
Absolutely. And yeah, a man who meant a great deal to me. And I thought perhaps we could finish off this episode now by just really, I suppose, talking about our very early memories of perhaps the first Romero film we remember seeing. And then I'll tell the story about the gift that I got from Romero. Mm-hmm. That still means a lot to me. So, Tom, perhaps we'll start with you. What's your earliest memory of when you were really aware of the fact that you were watching a George Romero movie?
Well, there's kind of two parts to that, because the Dead movies actually came to me quite late. The first time I saw Dawn of the Dead was on DVD, so it wasn't even in the VHS age. But when I was a kid, I can't remember how old I was, but it was when Michael Jackson's Thriller first came out on VHS. I can't remember when Thriller came out, and it was a big deal then. You know, the movie
1983, I think.
Was it? So
I think so.
So I'd have been, around 7 years old, and it was a big deal. You know, everyone was talking about that, and Michael Jackson was sort of near the peak of his powers, and when it came out on VHS to buy, I asked my auntie for my birthday, so I must have been about 8 or 9 years old, can you get me the videotape of Thriller? And she misunderstood and thought I meant a Thriller, and she bought me Creepshow.
Wow.
Now, Creepshow I wouldn't really call a thriller, but, whatever. She obviously didn't know her way around the video store very well. So I had this tape of Creepshow, and I watched it, and I just fell in love with it. But I was probably too young to really know that it was George Romero. You don't take notice of directors and things when you're 8 years old.
No.
But I fell in love with that movie, and that's where my deep love of it comes from. But then years later, it was when I knew I was watching a Romero movie, was probably in the DVD age, so I kind of came to him quite late, and that's when I got Night and Dawn on DVD, and really just gave those movies multiple watches. I said on Twitter I've probably rewatched George Romero movies more than any other movies in my lifetime.
Yeah, it could be very true for me as well. I mean, that's a lovely story, though. I don't know if I have one that quite measures up to it, really, just because I'm not entirely sure. I think Dawn of the Dead may have been the first Romero film that I saw, and I think I may have seen it on VHS. But my first real memory of something that really sticks in my memory was getting a Dawn of the Dead a Dead Trilogy DVD box set that had the Night of the Living Dead 30th anniversary edition on it. Yeah, and Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, but I think I saw Dawn of the Dead many, many years prior. But for some reason, the memory that sticks out to me the most, but probably because I was old enough to really remember it, because I actually bought it with my own money, was this box set. And of course, I sat down and watched and I'd seen Night of the Living Dead on TV.
Yeah.
So, because Night of the Living Dead, it's not difficult to find. It's everywhere because of its public domain nature, which is unfortunate for Romero. And so I remember getting this box set, and I sat down and watched the Night of the Living Dead 30th anniversary edition, and was just floored at how terrible it was. Because it is, if you don't know about it, it's Night of the Living Dead with new sequences that were shot by John Russo, and added and spliced into the film. And they were shot in the 90s, but he tries to make it look as if they really belonged in the film, because he shoots them. They're shot in black and white, but they're really terrible. They're really poorly acted, and they don't fit in the film whatsoever. And it's a travesty that could only have been made because of its public domain nature, unfortunately. And so you have to dismiss that. And I remember a couple of years later getting the Millennium edition of the movie and stuff, and starting to really track stuff down on eBay. Anyway, watched Dawn of the Dead on there, loved it just as much as I did the first time. And I saw Day of the Dead for the first time as part of that DVD box set, and I remember it looking horrible. Because at that time, people didn't really... I mean, there was Anchor Bay, but we look at Arrow and companies like that now, and they're really doing a bang-up job on the transfers and things like that. 88 Films, companies like that. But at the time, it wasn't as as prevalent in the sort of DVD studios as it is now. And I remember just being floored by the intelligence of Dawn of the Dead. That was something that always struck me really about Romero. Is there's a real intelligence to that man as a filmmaker. And I suppose I'll end this episode really by talking about the gift that I was given, which is it's quite a simple story and it's quite a short story really. A couple of years ago, my now ex-girlfriend went to a convention in America and met a bunch of different people there, people she's a big fan of because she was a big fan of comic books and a big fan of horror like myself. And she ended up meeting George Romero. And I remember being incredibly jealous of that. And she sort of sent me a message and said, well, I'm just off to meet George Romero now and I'll tell you all about it when I come back. And I was like, wow, what an incredible experience. And I didn't hear from her for a while. And then she just sent me a video. And there was no, she didn't say to me, oh, hi, Chris, this is what I thought of it. She just sent me a video. And I thought, what's this? And and I started playing the video, and sat there was George Romero. And he's looking at the camera with those big, beautiful black glasses on. And she said to him, I wonder if you could say hi to my boyfriend, Chris. He's back in England. And he didn't just say hello to me. He said a couple of really nice things, how you doing there in London, man? I wish I could come. I wish you were here with me now. I wish I could get to meet you. I love the English, all that sort of stuff. Oh. And I when she sent me the video, I'm getting choked up now thinking about it. When she sent me the video, I promise you, I got up from my chair and I ran around the house. Practically screaming like a child. It meant that much to me.
Yeah.
And it's still a video that means a lot to me even now, to have had that experience. And on the one hand, you might think, well, he didn't actually see you, didn't know who you were or whatever, but he said my name. I remember actually texting that back to her and saying, he said my name, and saying it over and over again. And that was a real gift to me that it meant a lot to me then, and it means a lot to me now. Now that he's sadly no longer with us, to know that he said I got to sort of meet him through the screen of the phone.
That's beautiful.
It meant a lot to me.
Yeah,
it's really it really touched me. Really touched me. So, George Romero, from 1940 to 2017. Thank you for everything that you gave us. Thank you for everything that you gave the horror genre. So several different genres, but thank you for what you created. You meant a lot to me, as I'm sure he meant a lot to you, Tom.
Yeah. We love you, George. We hope your journey to wherever it is a good one. And I know it will be. I know it will be, because you were a real gent. You were a real diamond. And like I said, we love you, George. Thank you.
Absolutely, man. Look, have a party up there with Wes Craven and make Two Evil Eyes too. You can do it. You can do it. You're what an important man you were, and you shall be very, very sadly missed. So that's our tribute to George Romero. We hope we were able to do him some justice, and we were feeling the sadness along with you, and we continue to feel it. And we hope you enjoyed this. And it seems like a strange way to kind of sign off and say, well, you won't be hearing from us on this feed for a while longer. We are, as you probably know from the Strange and Deadly update we gave you a little while ago, we're pressing forward with our new superhero podcast. And this is not really the place to be promoting that, but you'll be getting something else on this feed in the future that kind of introduces that. And we will return to the Strange and Deadly show in the future to finish off our list. Thank you very much for listening, and I've been Chris Clayton.
And I'm Tom Elliott.
And we'll speak to you soon. Take care, guys.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to The Strange and Deadly Show. Music by Danny Davis. Artwork by Darking One. To listen to the back catalogue of The Strange and Deadly Show, visit our website strangeanddeadly.com.